The stars stretched infinitely beyond the gleaming hull of the Erebus, Earth's flagship, a symbol of humanity's last attempt to hold on to their autonomy in a galaxy that viewed them as little more than pests. Captain Mara Kane, eyes steely but weary, stared out at the vastness of the cosmos. The space around her seemed to hum with an eerie tension, a space both familiar and alien. The ship, cutting through the dark velvet of the void, carried the weight of her world, of all humanity's last hope. Her thoughts often wandered, as they did now, back to Earth, her home. The once bustling metropolis, full of color, noise, and life, was now just a faint, distant memory. Humanity's future no longer lay among the familiar landscapes of Earth, but in the fragile alliances and tactical decisions that stretched across the stars. The galaxy had no place for the human spirit, but Kane wouldn't let that stop her. She wasn't the first to defy the odds. Humanity had always thrived on rebellion, on perseverance against those who sought to oppress them. And now, as the Erebus tore through the heavens, Kane knew the fight was only beginning. The Earth Alliance, a hodgepodge of colonies on the edge of the galaxy, had long resisted the overbearing rule of the Zergans, a technologically superior, coldly logical alien species. Humanity had tried to play by their rules, to integrate into the galactic system, but the Zergans' true goal was never peace. It was submission. A soft chime broke her reverie. The communications console blinked urgently. A message from the Alliance's Central Command. "Captain Kane," came the voice of Admiral Trask, an older man who had seen the first days of the rebellion. "The Zergans have issued their ultimatum. Total surrender or extinction." Kane closed her eyes briefly. She knew the stakes. She had heard the threats before, but this time it felt different. This time the Zergans weren't bluffing. She felt the pressure of command in her bones, the weight of millions of lives depending on the decisions she made. "This isn't just about survival," Kane muttered to herself. "This is about the soul of humanity." She turned, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "Prepare the fleet for departure. We're not going to bend. Not today. Not ever." The crew of the Erebus moved swiftly, driven by the same resolve that Kane had instilled in them. But, even as the ship slipped into warp speed, the doubts lingered. Humanity had always been a scrappy, creative species, but they were also small. Underdogs in a galaxy filled with titans. Could they truly face down the overwhelming might of the Zergan Empire? Kane didn't have time to ponder these questions. The time for hesitation had passed. The time for rebellion had arrived. The hum of the Erebus engines vibrated through the deck, steady and reassuring. Yet the tension among the crew was palpable. Over the comms, murmurs echoed, unsure whispers about what was to come, about the fleet they were preparing to face. An Alliance diplomat was on board, one who had once spoken of peace, of negotiation with the Zergans. But now even they had to admit that peace was no longer an option. The Zergans had made it clear they would not allow humanity to remain free. "All hands brace for impact," came the voice of First Officer Jalen Voss. His calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to the emotions running through the crew. He was a pragmatist, believing in the hard truths of their fight. He wasn't the type to sugarcoat things. Kane trusted him, and yet she could feel the distance between them. There was no room for personal feelings in war, especially when survival was on the line. And yet in the silence of the command deck, a gnawing doubt crept into her mind. Was it better to give in? Could they live to fight another day by surrendering? No. Humanity had never been a species to submit. They were the ones who invented fire, who defied the very idea that the stars were out of reach. If the Zergans wanted to break them, they would have to do so by tearing apart every last shred of humanity's will to fight. The meeting with the Zergan envoy had been scheduled for the following day. It would take place in the heart of neutral space, an ancient asteroid field where no one had claimed dominion. Humanity's hope rested on a peaceful resolution, but Kane had little faith in it. It wasn't just about diplomacy. It was about survival. They had no choice but to face the storm head-on. As the Erebus neared the location of the summit, the stars around them seemed to grow dimmer. The looming shadow of the Zergan fleet had already appeared in the distance, like a vast dark cloud, ominous and unyielding. There was no escaping the fact that the galaxy's greatest power was standing just beyond the edge of humanity's reach. And yet, within that cold vacuum, Kane felt a spark, a defiance that couldn't be extinguished. She stared out into the abyss once more, her hands clenched at her side. "Let them come," she whispered. "Let them see what happens when they push humanity too far." The Erebus slowed to a crawl, its shields now up and ready, the hum of the engines replaced with a quiet anticipation. Everything had led to this moment, and there was no turning back. But as the ship drifted closer to the asteroid field, a chill crept over Kane, a sudden sense of foreboding. She wasn't just worried about the physical danger, it was something deeper, something more primal. The Zergans hadn't just come for submission, they had come to break humanity's spirit. Kane's hand tightened on the armrest. The hour of decision was fast approaching. And it wasn't just her future that rested on her shoulders, it was the fate of humanity itself. The meeting had been set, a final diplomatic effort before the bloodshed began. Captain Mara Kane stood in the observation deck of the Erebus, watching as the dark expanse of the asteroid field loomed closer. The fleet had arrived. The Zergan flagship, Iridana, a monstrous construct of gleaming metal and foreboding energy, hovered like a specter in the distance. It was impossible to ignore the sheer scale of their power. The Zergans were not like the ragtag factions humanity had dealt with before. Their empire had endured for centuries, built on unyielding logic and cold pragmatism. A soft buzz interrupted her thoughts, and she turned sharply toward the communication console. It was an encrypted message from the Alliance's diplomatic envoy, a slender hope of avoiding bloodshed, but Kane knew better. The Zergans didn't come to negotiate. They came to dominate. The envoy was already there, waiting. The idea was simple. Extend the hand of diplomacy, offer humanity's formal submission, and hope the Zergans would be satisfied with their victory. The message from Admiral Trask had been clear. We'll try peace, but we must prepare for the worst. But Kane couldn't shake the feeling that peace had never truly been on the table. She'd seen it in their eyes, in their speeches. The Zergans had made their stance clear long ago. It wasn't about coexistence. It was about control. Human Ambassador Erix Valen, an experienced negotiator who had once brokered fragile accords between colonies, stepped up beside her. The man looked tired, worn down by the weight of this mission. His sharp, angular face betrayed little emotion, but Kane could sense the anxiety that coiled in his chest. "The Zergans will demand more than we can give," Kane said quietly, her gaze still fixed on the looming Iridana. Valen nodded, rubbing his forehead. "We're running out of options, Mara. We either offer submission, or we risk everything." Her fingers drummed on the edge of the console, the cool metal grounding her in the reality of their choices. Everything. The Zergans could destroy them. They had the firepower, the technology, the experience. The fleet that had gathered, once the pride of humanity, seemed like a moth to the flame in comparison. "Do you think they'll take our surrender?" Valen asked, his voice low, hesitant. "No," Kane replied sharply. "They'll take our will first, they'll take our spirit." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. For the Zergans, victory wasn't just about conquest. It was about erasing the very essence of humanity. It wasn't about defeating a military force. It was about breaking a people. They saw humanity as rebellious, unruly, unpredictable. And that, to the Zergans, was the greatest sin of all. Kane turned to Valen. "We'll go through the motions. You'll meet with them, try to negotiate. But in the end, we must be prepared. If they give us an ultimatum, we won't submit. We will resist." Valen hesitated. "If we resist, we're signing our death warrants. If we submit," Kane replied with a firm conviction, "we lose everything." The Zergan delegation arrived on their ship, a dark, sleek vessel that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their appearance was as intimidating as their ship, tall, imposing, and utterly alien. Their eyes were cold, calculating, unfeeling. They stood at the center of the room, their leader, General Eric, a towering figure with pale, almost translucent skin, taking the lead. "I am General Eric of the Zergan Empire," he spoke, his voice resonating with an unnatural, eerie calm. "We come to bring order to this chaos you call rebellion." Kane's lips curled into a thin, tight smile. The general's words were as calculated as the precision of their weapons. The Zergans had never been interested in diplomacy. It was all part of their larger game. "The only chaos here, General," Kane said, her voice sharp, "is the one you've created, the one you're trying to enforce." A flicker of something, perhaps irritation, perhaps amusement, crossed Eric's expression, but it was gone in an instant. He folded his hands behind his back, eyes narrowing slightly. "You misunderstand," Eric said, the words coming with a chilling sense of finality. "This isn't about your rebellion, this is about the survival of your species. You will submit. The alternative is annihilation." Kane's heart pounded, her jaw clenched. It was exactly as she'd feared. The Zergans weren't negotiating. They were demanding humanity's complete and total surrender, stripping them of their autonomy, their history, their future. A silent moment passed between them, heavy with the weight of their words. Kane had expected this ultimatum, but facing it now, in the cold, sterile confines of the meeting room, it felt different, more real, more dangerous. She looked out the window, the blackness of space stretching endlessly before her, and for a moment, a sense of helplessness crept over her. And yet, as she looked around at her crew, the flicker of defiance in their eyes reminded her, humanity didn't know how to submit. They didn't know how to bend. "Let's be clear, General," Kane said, her voice unwavering. "We won't submit to your rule. You're offering extinction, but you've underestimated one thing." "And what is that?" Eric asked, his tone icy. "Us," she said simply. "Humans never know when to quit." The silence was broken by a sudden sharp blip on the radar, an incoming transmission. Before Eric could respond, an emergency alert blared through the ship's systems. The Zergans' eyes snapped to the screen, and their calm demeanor cracked, for the first time. The warning signaled a sudden mass of unidentified ships, human vessels suddenly swarming from the edges of the asteroid field. They had come to join the fight. The words of the Zergan general echoed in the room, his voice a low growl. "You dare to defy us?" Kane's gaze hardened, her pulse quickening. This was it. The moment had arrived. The rebellion had begun. The Erebus and its allied fleets hurtled through space, a ragtag collective of humanity's last bastion, the resolve of their shared struggle driving them ever forward. In the wake of the failed diplomatic mission, General Eric's response had been swift and devastating. A swift strike on several independent colonies had shattered any hope of peaceful coexistence. The Zergans had come with the weight of their vast fleet, an overwhelming display of power meant to crush all defiance. But humanity had never been a species to kneel without a fight. Captain Mara Kane paced the war room of the Erebus, her mind heavy with the weight of command. The fleet had narrowly escaped the Zergan strike force, but it wasn't enough. They were bleeding, scattered, their very survival in jeopardy. The Zergans knew this, and yet they were relentless. Kane had expected this kind of retaliation, an immediate show of force, but the sheer scale of their attacks still rattled her. "We can't outrun them forever," said Jalen Voss, her first officer, his usually steady voice laced with anxiety. "We're a fleet of 5 ships, Mara. The Zergans will wipe us out before we can even think about regrouping." Kane's jaw tightened, and she turned toward the tactical display, where the glowing red dots of the Zergan fleet had begun to approach. They were outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered. But there was one thing humanity still had in spades: ingenuity. "We don't need to outrun them," she said, her voice hard as steel. "We need to make them chase us. We need to make them believe that we're weak, that we're splintering." Voss raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting a diversion?" Kane nodded. her mind already working through the plan, a grim smirk on her face. Precisely. We'll send a decoy fleet to draw their attention while the rest of us regroup and strike from the shadows. The Zergans are confident, overconfident, and that will be their downfall. Meanwhile, the crew of the Erebus worked tirelessly to prepare the decoy fleet. Unmanned ships filled with malfunctioning systems, meant to simulate the chaos of a disbanding fleet. They would be left behind in the path of the Zergans, a bait, to buy them precious time. The plan was dangerous, but it was humanity's only hope. If the Zergans fell for it, they could win. If not, they would die trying. As the false fleet set off on its dangerous mission, Kane found herself alone in her quarters, staring at the cold expanse of space outside her window. She had always known this day would come. She had always known humanity's spirit would be tested. But now that the moment was here, the enormity of it hit her like a physical blow. Her thoughts wandered to the people she had left behind on Earth. Her younger sister Lila, who had been one of the first to volunteer for the rebellion. Lila had always believed in a better future, one where humanity's reach didn't end at the stars. But would she be able to live with the choices they had made? The sacrifices? Kane's fist clenched as she looked out into the void. No. There was no turning back now. The future would be forged by their hands, for better or worse, but humanity would fight to the last. Back in the control room, the decoy fleet had begun its dance with death. The Zergans, seeing the signals of failure, rushed to engage. Kane's plan was in motion. "Now we wait," Kane said, her voice tense. "Let them think they have us." Hours passed like a slow crawl through molasses. The Erebus and its surviving fleet drifted silently, cloaked by the dense asteroid field, waiting for the Zergans to take the bait. The clock ticked louder and louder in Kane's mind, the tension unbearable. She knew that any mistake, any miscalculation could be their last. The decoy fleet, stranded on a collision course with the Zergan warships, would make its final stand, buying just enough time for the real fleet to regroup. But it was not going to be enough for a second chance. Then came the call. A distress signal, a transmission from the decoy fleet. "This is courageous. We are under heavy fire. We won't hold out much longer." The voice was shaky, a young ensign, probably one of the thousands who had joined this war, eager to prove themselves. Kane's gut clenched. Her heart sank as the countdown to their final assault began. They had to make their move now. The Zergans were distracted, but not for long. "Move out," she commanded. "Launch all fighters. Target the Zergan flanks. We hit them hard, fast, and then we vanish into the shadows. We're not here to die today." The battle erupted in a stunning flash of fire and fury. The Erebus and its remaining fleet struck from the shadows, their fighters weaving in and out of the battlefield like ghosts, hitting the Zergan forces where they least expected. For a moment, it felt like they had a fighting chance. They were faster, more unpredictable, and most importantly, more desperate. But as the first Zergan warship crumbled in a fiery explosion, the true cost of the battle became evident. As expected, the Zergans didn't fall easily. They regrouped quickly, adapting to the human tactics with terrifying precision. The decoy fleet had bought them time, but now the Zergans were turning the tide. "I'm seeing more ships coming out of nowhere," Voss said, his voice a mix of awe and dread. "They've adapted." Kane's eyes widened. This wasn't just a battle. The Zergans were not merely soldiers. They were a hive mind, a species that thought as one. The loss of a few ships wouldn't deter them. They were evolving, growing, more efficient in real time. They had anticipated humanity's strategy, and there it was. A new threat, rogue Zergan fighters, flanking their position with unmatched speed and coordination. The game had changed. The Zergans weren't just an alien species. They were a highly evolved force, and humanity had underestimated them. "Get us out of here!" Kane shouted, panic creeping into her voice for the first time. "Take evasive maneuvers, I want full shields." But it was already too late. The Zergans had adapted. The overwhelming might of their empire was crashing. down on humanity's fragile defense. The reality sank in as the ship lurched under fire. For all their ingenuity, all their rebellious spirit, humanity was still fighting an empire that saw them as little more than an anomaly. A nuisance to be wiped away. But Kane wouldn't let this be the end. Humanity's resilience burned hotter than ever, and she wasn't going to let them die quietly. She couldn't. "Hold on," she barked, looking at her crew. "This is just the beginning. We don't stop fighting. Not now. Not ever." The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. The stars above seemed to burn brighter as the battle raged on, a chaotic dance of death between the Erebus and the Zergan fleet. Every corner of space around the human ships was filled with the shrieking sound of gunfire, explosions, and the guttural hum of Zergan engines. It was impossible to tell which ship was friend and which was foe, the darkness and the blaze of the fight blurring the line between victory and destruction. Captain Mara Kane stood at the helm, her face set in grim determination, her knuckles white as she gripped the command chair. The ship trembled as a volley of fire struck the Erebus's shields, but they held, just barely. The decoy fleet had drawn the Zergans in, giving the human fighters a brief but hard-earned opportunity to strike. Yet now, with the full force of the Zergan fleet encircling them, the fight felt increasingly hopeless. "Shields down to 40%, Captain," Voss shouted from his station, sweat beading on his forehead. "We can't keep this up for much longer." Kane's eyes flitted across the tactical display, trying to find a path out of this death spiral. Zergan fighters were everywhere, their superior speed and coordination overwhelming human efforts. The rebellion was on the verge of collapse, and yet, in that moment, there was something unmistakable. The humanity inside her crew, inside the hearts of her people. It was an energy, a fire that refused to go out. "Push forward," Kane barked. "Hit them where it hurts. I don't care if we have to tear the Iridana apart with our bare hands. Keep fighting." The Erebus veered sharply, firing at a Zergan cruiser, shaking under the impact of enemy fire. The human fighters flanked their enemies, diving in and out of the battlefield with incredible agility. They weren't faster or stronger than their enemies, but they had something else, a resilience, a refusal to give up. Humanity was built on that defiance, and now it was on full display. But even as the Zergan ships took damage, Kane could see the tides turning. The Iridana was organizing its forces, and the Zergans were relentless. Their hive mind, their perfect unity, was pushing back with brutal efficiency. Every human ship that fell, every fighter that was lost, pushed humanity closer to the brink. And still, Kane pressed on, her eyes locked on the heart of the storm. In the midst of the chaos, a cold voice crackled through the communication system. General Eric's calm, unnervingly controlled voice boomed across the comms, chilling everyone. "Aboard the Erebus, you fight like cornered animals, but that will not save you. Your rebellion ends here, Captain Kane. We are your final test. Submit, or perish." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, the weight of his words hung in the air like a cold, oppressive cloud. Kane's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. She had faced down death too many times to be intimidated now. "This isn't over," Kane muttered, her eyes narrowing. "We're not submitting, General. We'll die standing." With a fierce breath, she activated the final phase of their strategy. In the midst of the escalating conflict, the Erebus released a barrage of decoy drones, millions of them, mimicking their ship's signals, overwhelming the Zergan sensors. It was a gamble, one final attempt to turn the tables. It would buy them mere seconds, but seconds were enough to change everything. As the decoys flooded the battlefield, the Zergan's fleet hesitated. In the vastness of space, every second counted, and in that brief moment of confusion, Kane made her move. She issued the order to launch the remaining human fighters in a concentrated strike at the heart of the Zergan flagship. "Now, take the Iridana down," she ordered, her voice fierce. The strike force hit hard, their ships streaking toward the Iridana's vulnerable flank, each pilot fighting with a level of desperation that made them almost impossible to predict. They moved like phantoms, capitalizing on the brief moment of disarray created by the decoys. The Iridana, though massive and armored, was not invulnerable, and the human fighters found small weaknesses, small gaps in the Zergan armor, and they exploited them with brutal efficiency. Kane watched the battle unfold on the viewscreen. Every explosion, every hull breach was a testament to humanity's ingenuity and spirit. Despite everything, the overwhelming power of the Zergans, the odds stacked against them, humanity was still fighting. They were pushing back, not because they had a chance of winning, but because they had something the Zergans could never understand, a reason to fight. The air was thick with tension as the human fighters engaged in their final charge. The Zergans, thrown off balance for only a moment, were quick to retaliate. They countered with precision, their coordinated strikes tearing apart human ships. But Kane saw something change in the fight, a subtle shift. The Zergans, for the first time, began to doubt. And then it happened. A direct hit from the Erebus's main cannon sent a shockwave through the Zergan flagship. The ship's outer defenses faltered. Kane's heart leapt. They had done it. The Iridana was vulnerable, but victory was short-lived. As the Iridana began to crack, another far more devastating reality set in. Kane received a transmission from the Zergan command, and the message it carried was unlike any before. "The war is not over, Captain Kane." Eric's voice rang out coldly. "You have killed one of us, but in doing so you've sealed your fate. We are not alone. We will rebuild. And this time, there will be no place for you to hide." The Zergans were not just a single force, they were a network, a collective intelligence, and they had prepared for this. What humanity had done, they had anticipated. Their true power wasn't in numbers or ships. It was in their ability to adapt, to rebuild, and to endure. But the rebellion was far from over. As the Erebus pulled back, its hull scarred, its engines failing, Kane looked out at the wreckage of the Iridana. Humanity had done the impossible. They had struck at the heart of their enemies, defied their conquerors, and made their stand. But there was a bitter taste to the victory. It wasn't a clean win, it was a battle, and it was only the beginning. The Zergans would return. They always did. But so would humanity. This war, this rebellion, it had only just begun. The Erebus limped through space, its hull scarred and battered from the fierce battle with the Zergans. Its engines, once a symbol of humanity's engineering brilliance, now groaned under the strain of their last desperate push. The crew, bloodied and exhausted, moved with quiet determination, knowing that the fight was far from over. Captain Mara Kane stood at the observation deck, gazing out at the remnants of the Iridana, the Zergan flagship, now a twisted heap of metal and debris. It had been a victory, but it felt hollow. The human fighters had struck a blow against the invaders, but the cost had been high. Too many good men and women had fallen. Too many ships had been lost. "Admiral Trask," Kane spoke over the comms, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions roiling inside her. "We've done what we could, but we can't hold out much longer. The Zergans are regrouping. They'll be back, and next time they'll be ready." There was a long pause before Trask's voice crackled back over the line. "I know, Captain. We're already sending out messages to the other colonies. We need reinforcements, supplies, and we need them now. We can't let them think we're done." Kane nodded, though Trask couldn't see it. "We're not done. Not yet." As the Erebus drifted closer to a nearby asteroid field to find a temporary refuge, the crew began the grim task of recovering what they could from the wreckage. Salvage teams worked tirelessly, pulling what they could from the fallen ships, scrap metal, engines, anything that might be of use in the inevitable next battle. It was a painful process, yet there was an unspoken sense of unity that bound them all together. They were not just survivors, they were rebels. Kane walked through the corridors of the ship, her mind 1,000 miles away, her thoughts heavy with the weight of leadership. She'd led them through the storm, but this next phase would be even more dangerous. Humanity had won a victory, but they had also drawn the ire of a force far more relentless than anything they had ever known. The Zergans would come for them, and they wouldn't stop until humanity was either subjugated or eradicated. But as she walked, she saw the faces of her crew, determined, scarred, but unbroken. That was the heart of the rebellion, a refusal to give in, no matter the cost. Later that evening, Kane gathered her senior officers for a debrief. They had to make plans. They had to prepare for what came next. "We're going to need more than just tactics," Kane began, addressing Voss, Valen, and the rest of her command team. "We need to bring more people into the fold. The Zergans may be powerful, but they underestimate us, underestimate our need to survive. We can't just defend ourselves. We need to become something they can't ignore." Voss looked at her, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "You're suggesting we take the fight to them?" Kane met his gaze, her eyes hard and resolute. "Exactly. But we need to build something bigger. This rebellion can't just be a fleet of isolated ships. We need to unite every colony, every system we can find. The Zergans can wipe out a fleet, but they can't fight an entire galaxy rising against them." Valen leaned forward, a cautious look on his face. "You're asking for a full-scale insurrection. Are we ready for that? We've just bled ourselves dry. We need time, resources, everything we can scrape together. And we need allies, not just in the colonies, but out there in the galaxy." Kane didn't flinch. "I know it's risky, but it's our only chance. We've already shown the galaxy that we can stand up to the Zergans. But that's not enough. We need to show them that humanity isn't just a colony of rebels. We're a force and we can't be ignored." The officers fell silent. The plan was bold, dangerous, but it was the only path forward. "Then we make it happen," Voss said, his voice firm, unwavering. Kane nodded. "We'll need every ship, every soldier, every resource we can gather. I'll reach out to the resistance movements on the outer rim, the colonies on the farthest edges of the galaxy. It's time they knew what we're capable of." In the days that followed, the Erebus became a hub for a growing resistance network, a symbol of human perseverance and ingenuity. Ships from distant colonies began to trickle in, carrying supplies, fighters, and, most importantly, hope. The rebellion had sparked something larger than itself. Humanity had not just fought back against the Zergans, but against the idea that they could be so easily erased. It was a ripple in the water that was slowly becoming a wave. As more ships arrived and the fleet grew, the reality of what they faced began to sink in. The Zergans were relentless and their resources were vast. But the rebellion, now unified under Kane's leadership, was evolving into something more, something capable of standing toe-to-toe with the might of the Empire. But even as humanity gathered its strength, there was still a cost to victory. Kane received a message one evening, a personal transmission. It was from Lila, her younger sister, who had been part of the first wave of fighters in the outer colonies. The message was short and to the point. "We're holding the line, but the Zergans are already regrouping. They're sending reinforcements. We need you here, Mara." Kane's heart ached as she read the words, knowing what it meant. It was a call for help, another reminder that no matter how far humanity had come, the war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Kane stood on the bridge, staring out at the sea of stars. She thought about the people she had lost, the lives that had been sacrificed for this cause. The weight of it was unbearable at times. But then she thought of her crew, her family. They had fought and bled for this chance at survival, for freedom, for a future. The rebellion was more than just a military effort. It was a statement. Humanity would not be erased, not by the Zergans, not by anyone. They would carve their place in the stars, and no matter what happened, they would face the future with the same resilience that had brought them this far. She turned to Voss, who stood at the helm. "Get us ready for the next fight, Jalen. We're not waiting any longer. We've taken the first steps. Now we finish this." Voss met her gaze, the same determination burning in his eyes. "Aye, Captain. We're with you all the way." And with that, the Erebus began its next journey into the unknown, a ship and a crew united by a singular purpose, to defy the odds and ensure that humanity's flame would never be extinguished. The stars outside the Erebus seemed quieter now, calmer, as though the galaxy itself was holding its breath. After the chaos of the battle, After the countless losses and the uncertain future, the crew of the Erebus finally found some semblance of peace. But it was a fragile peace, a temporary pause in a war that had only just begun. Captain Mara Kane stood in the war room once again, staring at the map of the galaxy sprawled across the table. It was no longer just a list of sectors and star systems. It had become a map of rebellion, a web of resistance spreading across the farthest reaches of space. Humanity had done the impossible, uniting disparate colonies, building alliances with other alien factions and preparing for a future that was now possible. But there was no illusion of safety. The Zergans had felt the sting of humanity's defiance, and they wouldn't forget it. They were not a race to forgive. This war was far from over. But for the first time since the Erebus had set off from Earth, Kane could see something else in the stars. A chance. A chance to build something stronger than any alien empire could ever hope to break. "We've made progress," Kane said softly to Voss, who stood beside her, his eyes scanning the latest reports. "But we haven't won. Not yet." Voss, ever the realist, nodded in agreement. "The Zergans are already regrouping. We've sparked something across the galaxy, but they're coming. They'll be ready this time." Kane felt a deep, aching weariness in her bones. She'd fought wars before, led her crew through the unthinkable, but the weight of this war, this struggle for humanity's very existence, had taken more out of her than she cared to admit. And yet, there was something unyielding about her, now. Something that had been born from the fires of rebellion. Humanity had survived against the odds, and as long as she had breath in her body, she would fight to ensure they kept surviving. "Then we fight back. We've got one shot at this, Jalen. We can't waste it." He met her gaze, a spark of fire in his eyes. "We'll be ready, Captain. Every ship, every fighter, every colony. We'll make sure the Zergans know one thing. Humanity is not something you conquer." As the Erebus continued its journey toward the rendezvous point with the other resistance fleets, Kane found herself on the observation deck once more. The silence in the room was almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed the ship just days before. The stars stretched out before her, countless possibilities, countless worlds, each a story yet to be written. The message from Lila still weighed heavily on her heart. Her sister, so much like her, fierce, passionate, and committed to the cause, was out there, fighting on the front lines. Kane had promised to be there with her, to join the fight. But the road ahead was not one that could be taken lightly. The first major victory had been theirs, but the cost had been immense. The Zergans had lost their flagship, their command center, but they were not defeated. The rebellion had only scratched the surface of their empire. There was a much larger force at play, one that would be much harder to topple. Kane couldn't help but wonder. Were they just beginning to stir a hornet's nest? Then a transmission came through, cutting into her thoughts. It was a transmission from a previously unknown source, one that wasn't recognized by any of the human fleets. It wasn't from the Zergans, but from someone else, someone new. Kane's hand hovered over the console. She had a choice: ignore it or listen. Her instincts screamed at her to be cautious, to shut it out, but in her gut, there was a flicker of something else, a sense of urgency. She activated the transmission. The voice that came through the speakers was distorted yet undeniably clear. It was a voice from across the stars, and it sent a chill down her spine. "We have been watching. We know what you've done. We know what you can do." Kane's heart raced. This wasn't a simple threat. It wasn't a message of surrender or fear. It was a warning, a challenge. "We are not alone, and neither are you." The transmission cut out abruptly, leaving nothing but static in its wake. Kane stood frozen for a moment, staring at the blank screen. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who were they? What did they mean? And why were they watching? Behind her, Voss approached. "Who was that, Captain?" "I don't know," Kane replied, her voice calm but her mind alight with the possibilities. "But whoever they are, they know more about us than we'd like. And if they're reaching out now..." She trailed off, uncertainty clouding her usually unwavering confidence. The threat of the Zergans was still fresh, but now there was something New on the horizon, something that might either be humanity's salvation or its downfall. Voss watched her closely. Another player in the game? Kane nodded. It seems so, and they're not waiting around. Neither can we. She turned away from the console, her eyes scanning the stars once more. There were more threats out there than she had realized, but there was something else too. There were allies, potential forces that humanity hadn't yet discovered, perhaps waiting for the right moment to strike. A new chapter was about to begin, and it would not be one that humanity would face alone. As the Erebus sailed further into the unknown, Kane stood tall. She had no illusions. The future was uncertain, filled with dangers and challenges. But she was no longer afraid of what might come. Humanity had survived one impossible battle. What was to come next was a story yet to be written. One thing was clear. Humanity's spark would not fade easily. And as long as she was captain of this ship, she would see it through. With a deep breath, Kane made a decision. Set a course for the unknown, she said, her voice steady. Prepare for whatever comes next. We're not running anymore.